Whenever I reach an impasse in my writing, I start spending a lot of time on my porch. I call it Porch TV. And I believe that all of life's restrictions have already been resolved through some natural event or phenomenon that I can literally see from my porch. Just because I am not rooted down like a mountain or a tree does not mean I am any less an extension than the cosmos and natural world. From my front porch in the foothills of Appalachia, I can watch the slow progression of seasons. I can listen to the dusk chorus in the gloam. I can see lightning race itself across the sky. And sometimes, in the middle of the night, if I'm very lucky, I watch does and their fawns gracefully descend to get groceries in the neighbor's lawn. In late summer, I can see the planets, Mars and Venus, and the Perseid shower. And just a half mile up the road, I know of a small pond nestled into one of the peaks. As long as I keep tuning into Porch TV, I will never run out of metaphors. When my poetry students try and convince me that writer's block is like a thing, I reassure them that's impossible, because creation is still unfurling all around us, not unlike a fern. I tell them they're right where they need to be, and technically we're all still big banging, and to think of the writing process as solar system formation, so they can't mess it up. They don't entirely believe me, but eventually they often come to trust me, and when they've seen their own progress, having fought for inspiration first through low threshold entry writing exercises, scaffolded risks that boost their confidence over time, by the end of the semester they begin to see the larger themes running through their work. And their writing becomes more interrogative and explorative, more like trying to open a puzzle box so they don't feel so much pressure and anxiety to enter into a literary conversation with their own material. I also tell my students I won't ever subject them to any type of writing-related crisis I don't subject myself to as well. I often do the exercises with them and help them breathe through their stall-outs and freak-outs and panic attacks and triumphs and aha moments. Workshop then becomes more like a think tank where we are co-creating an experience. But to be completely transparent, my real writing is done in solitude during pretty strange hours. And when I reach a plateau, definitely not a block, a plateau. Certainly, there are few people I trust to talk me down out of my tree, or I just go work on something else, usually fiber arts related, until it works itself out. Solar system formation. Until recently. For the first time in maybe 20 years, I stalled out. For a while, my hubris wouldn't allow me to admit that what I was experiencing was, in fact, not just a plateau. It was full-blown writer's block, which, as it turns out, is like a total thing. Here's why I was blocked. I'm currently in the process of genre hopping. While I'm known primarily as a poet, my work is shape-shifting, and I let someone convince me to shape-shift a little more publicly. Okay, a lot more publicly. Last year, I was commissioned to write a play, which theoretically isn't a real stretch. I have a background in theater, and I've penned and performed successful one-acts and choreo poems, and even filmed a few short original screenplays, but this is my first full-length straight play, and its title character is one of the most well-known on the planet. I don't even have to say her name. All I have to say is snakes for hair, and you know exactly who I mean. And I'll admit, as much as I tried to make Medusa's origin story palatable and accessible to a 21st century audience, I found it unexpectedly challenging to depart from the monolithic conventions of myth and what we've already been told about her. I mean, the same myths that created Medusa continue to be enacted upon women. We continue to be depicted as sirens and harpies and oracles and crones, infinitely mysterious, often pornographic, but rarely divine, without some shard of our wholeness extracted. Our pedestal is not one of our own creation, and so many women still have no idea how to get down. What made matters worse was after I received some very encouraging feedback from my first readers on an unfinished draft, the director gave me a hard deadline to turn over the rest. Playtime was over, so to speak. A deadline? Deadline? Made it two pearls clutchingly real. After spending several months time traveling to 400 BCE to interview the world's thinkers and philosophers and artists and deities, I returned unceremoniously to the present. A deadline forced me to realize that people wouldn't just be reading my work, they'd be saying it and acting it out and paying to come see it. And if they didn't understand or like it, they'd want their money back. Now, if someone doesn't understand or like one of my poems, it's sort of an occupational hazard. Apart from other poets, not many people are voluntarily reading poetry these days unless they find it on Instagram first. It takes all kinds, But before it could be produced, this play would have to be signed off on by an entire department, then approved by someone else who holds the purse strings, and then my work would have to be advertised and marketed to the public in ways a contemporary poet is not typically accustomed to, as entertainment. So I stopped writing, one scene short of a complete play. And for 3 months, I spent some long overdue quality time with my imposter syndrome, binging on my favorite channel on Porch TV, Sir Reginald. Now, that's what I call the oak tree out front. I named him Sir Reginald because there are shapes in his bark that make him look like he has a face. The kindly, magnanimous face of a genteel, almost retired knight with a couple more good scraps left in him. And he stands over my house and watches it. Now, I've gotten to know Sir Reginald pretty well. I know the squirrel family that lives in his limbs and squabbles all day. My friends call them tree rats. I know the regular rotation of birds, the cardinals, the crows, the doves, the jays, and a couple woodpeckers. I know Sir Reginald tends to wait a few extra weeks to put out buds in early spring because all the young whippersnapper trees around him do not yet know that 1 or 2 warm days does not budding season make. They don't know what a frost can do like Sir Reginald does. He survived at least 100 of them. He survived a lightning strike too. You can still see the scorch marks in his bark and the wound wood. Sir Reginald has his fair share of wound wood. Wound wood is when a tree branch has been pruned or has fallen and the area puckers into a smooth, round scar, and the grain in the middle of the scar grows in a completely different direction than the rest of the bark, and no branch grows from that spot ever again. But Sir Reginald is a survivor, and his other branches keep reaching up and out so you barely see the scars. One day, after I hadn't written anything more about Medusa for a very long time, I came home from campus to find that after a storm, one of Sir Reginald's lower limbs had broken clean off into the lawn. I was shocked. Sir Reginald, what happened? Sometimes I make a cameo on Porch TV. I got out of the car and walked around and around the limb, which was one of his smaller branches, but at least 15 feet long and several inches in diameter, and it was heavy. I said, Sir Reginald, you are a strong tree. I'm gonna have to get someone else to move this off the lawn. But what I noticed right away was that there wasn't a single leaf on the branch at a time in the year where all of the other branches were dense with leaves. I looked up and saw that around the broken branch, fungi had feasted on it and weakened it, and so it fell. Why keep a limb around that wasn't serving its purpose anymore? It made more sense just to let it go. The fungi on Sir Reginald's fallen branch was dark orange and white and grew in a scalloped shape that resembled the overlapping scales of a snake. I remembered from my Medusa research that right before snakes shed a skin, they can become moody because they have a whole new skin that's grown in but can't use it until they break out of the old one. The old skin slows them down so they can't hunt as efficiently. It clouds their vision so they can't see. They are vulnerable and liable to be more exposed, their very survival threatened. So when they're finally ready to shed, a snake will find a rough patch, a boulder or tree bark to rub up against and break open the old skin. A healthy snake will shed in one piece. But for a snake whose environment isn't stable enough to support it, its skin will flake off in pieces, and it'll need a little help to shed. Sir Reginald never lets me down. That was my way in. I sat on my porch and began to write, which at that stage means I stared at one spot and didn't move for a very long time. Part of my process revolves around dreaming a scene all the way through before I write it. So there I was playing the missing scene, Medusa's final confrontation with Perseus. This scene had been the hardest to write because I felt this is what everyone was really going to come to see, the final battle between hero and monster, good versus evil, right versus wrong, winner versus loser. And this scene needed to be a true triumph, not just for Medusa, but for all women who have kept their rage bottled up for far too long. You see that? That's the kind of self-imposed pressure that stalled me out the first time. But I kept feeling like there needed to be an antithesis to the original story where Medusa should come out the victor over Perseus. But that didn't feel entirely authentic. I mean, simply reversing the outcome of their conflict feels like a placebo. Empowering in the moment, perhaps, but if Medusa won their battle via traditional means and, say, took Perseus's head, isn't that a reaction to the same sort of systemic hierarchy and patriarchal consciousness that, left so unchecked, has been causing problems in the first place? Wouldn't that ultimately produce as equally polarizing a dynamic? I assume that, like most people, Medusa would want to feel victorious, but as to the how, I mean, how does one make a victory sustainable enough to usher in a new paradigm? Systemic change begins as personal change. And because as a storyteller, I am aware that myths and stories are how we make sense of the world and our role in it. And because I identify with her so much, I wanted to reclaim Medusa's reputation for me too. I wanted this scene to feel personal, because in crafting an origin story for her, she was starting to feel less like a compatriot and more like a sister, and increasingly she feels like an extension of me. Part of the problem is that our expectation of the genre is that myths are supposed to be sensational. But life is so much more episodic. Our lives perceive more like The Office and less like Lord of the Rings. There's not one big boss at the end of a video game we need to defeat in real life. But audiences still enjoy those larger-than-life stories, and so to counteract the mundanities of the everyday, we continue to create greater odds and obstacles and more diabolical opponents with more special effects to make them feel real. But the boogeymen in our myths are much more complicated in real life, as are our relationships with them. In the 21st century, we're starting to see more and more multifaceted heroes who have flawed pasts, but are trying to leave the world a better place than the way they found it. Or everyday folks who are just trying to get by and sometimes get caught somewhere at the wrong place and wrong time and have to make a call. Most of our favorite stories are character-driven. We want to see how someone who reminds us a little of ourselves with all our fallibilities and inconsistencies and insecurities manages to get out of a jam. The moments that we tend to sensationalize that involve ritual and ceremony and rites of passage, the buildup is what actually takes the most energy to pull them off. How many people actually remember the events of their wedding day or graduation day? Those huge moments are less like destinations and more like pit stops. But the pomp we surround them with in our narrative often feels anticlimactic when you actually get to the big day, the big moment. Kind of like the candied pecans and cashews you can smell all over the mall, but when you get them, they never taste quite as good as they smell. Another thing, life doesn't exactly move in linear fashion as much as we'd like it to. What we have heard and what we have witnessed and experienced informs our present, sure, but because of the time-space continuum, if you live long enough, you will come to understand and trust that somewhere, somewhen, our future selves have already figured it out, whatever it is at the moment. But because of the prevalence of myths that favor a victor over an adversary, which we can recognize through their appearance as much as their behaviors, most of us are wired to think constantly in terms of beginning, middle, end, fraught with binaries, polarities, and either-or scenarios which leave little room for adaptation or paradox. So why don't we think more about life like it's choose your own adventure? Ancient myths, so many of which serve as the cornerstone of Western culture, our entertainment, our heroes' journeys. I mean, how many of those are actually applicable to our lives today? First of all, most of these stories are thousands of years old, and we just keep finding new ways to tell them to ourselves over and over and over again. They make us feel comfortable and secure and relaxed. We can escape our daily woes by reading or watching any number of our favorite stories, which include the ancient myths. And certainly we still have some of the same questions the ancients did, like, what are we all doing here, and how do I fit in? But why are we telling ourselves the same stories as the ancients, which are based off of their experiences, when we have access to so much more information about the world and one another as we are today? Perhaps even something that's been considered timeless has an expiration date. And if it doesn't, it's probably loaded down with preservatives, which means when you consume it, you're that much closer to a calcified heart. all along I'd been asking, why is Medusa so angry? Who is she really angry with? The men and heroes who came to take her power, or the gods who pointed them in her direction? Is she actually that terrifying, or is it her reputation? Does she mind what people say about her, or does it allow her to hide in plain sight? And why does she have to lose her head? What if there's another way to get Pegasus in the picture? What if Perseus isn't some demigod jock with Olympus-sized daddy issues? What is he really trying to prove? And why didn't the Gorgons, there were 3, who all had snakes for hair and wings, just leave? What I needed to ask was why we need a character like Medusa. In my attempt to completely overhaul the old myth, I overlooked the fact that there is often a reason why someone like Medusa has endured and why that moment of climax between her and Perseus is still important. Here's what I came up with. We need Medusa because we need a place to put our unfulfilled longings, our regret, our self-doubt, our shame, our rage. Not unlike Tessie and Shirley Jackson's haunting story, The Lottery, which is still trotted out in English classrooms all over the country to this day, humans seem to still need a scapegoat, someone to point the finger at when things go wrong, a dumping ground for the community to purge their collective sins. We seem to still need a place where our fear of the unknown goes to die. You know why the Gorgons didn't just leave? Because someone at some point had told them they were monsters, and so they thought their only option was to stay underground and do monstrous things. And yet, the name of one of Medusa's sisters is Sathino, which translates to strength or forceful, as in force of nature. And her other sister's name, Euryale, means far roaming or wide leaping, and Medusa means patroness or protectress or queen. The Gorgonian icon, bearing the snarling, demented visage of a woman with snakes for hair, was placed ultimately on Athena's shield. Medusa became a literal shield maiden, the emblem of a virago goddess. The snake was one of Athena's totems, which suggests transformation, enlightenment, and healing. The ancient Greeks replicated the Gorgon's face and wore it symbolically on armor and jewelry. They added it to buildings to fend off malevolent spirits, used it to warn folk away from dangerous locations, and even on occasion used it to decorate pottery. I guess it was their way of saying this plate is very hot. And even in the original stories, it can't be denied that Perseus created life in the desert when he flew over it, and drops of Medusa's blood fell to the sand, and snakes sprang forth, and coral reefs bloomed in the ocean when he flew over its waves. According to one version, the cry Sathino uttered upon Medusa's death inspired Athena to invent the flute. In the oldest stories about her, perhaps we needed Medusa because without her, we wouldn't have known what rock bottom looks or acts like, or where you can go from there. It seems odd to me now that what has been most feared about Medusa is that which brings about whatever we most value on this planet, expansion. My favorite passage from Khalil Gibran's The Prophet asserts, "The deeper that sorrow carves into your being, the more joy you can contain. Is not the cup that holds your wine the very cup that was burned in the potter's oven? And is not the lute that soothes your spirit the very wood that was hollowed with knives?" Medusa reminds us that you cannot have the creation of a new way without the destruction of the old. And yet, redeeming her story, her voice, is a way of saying yes. Medusa represents our fear, but she remains a part of the collective because we still don't know what to do with her. But rather than slay her in every retelling, what if Medusa is the perfect person to help us transmute our own neglect and pain into grace? How does a person reincarnate in what Mary Oliver calls your one wild and precious life? If the popularized version of the Medusa myth teaches us nothing else, it's what not to do. It's that our own stories cannot expand unless the outdated bits are shed first. So how do you reclaim the reputation of a monster? Well, you decide to stop answering to the name, because that's what was missing from the original myth, the power of choice. To create new tread in familiar mythos, We could consider what might happen if she chooses to accept about herself what others reject. What if she convinces Perseus his fight isn't actually with her? What if she keeps her head this time? What if she takes her sisters with her? What if, after thousands of years underground, they all decide to come up for air? I found my scene. See you all on opening night. Thank you.